April 27, 1945. The Elbe River Valley, somewhere between the shattered remnants of the Third Reich and the advancing tide of liberation. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke, the kind that clings to clothing and never quite washes away. In a makeshift detention compound hastily constructed from canvas tents and barbed wire, a line of German women stood in the cold drizzle of a spring morning that felt more like winter. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollowed by exhaustion and something deeper, a kind of spiritual emptiness that comes from watching the world you knew collapse into ash and memory. They wore the ragged gray uniforms of auxiliary forces, some still bearing the insignia of units that no longer existed. Their hands trembled, not only from the cold, but from uncertainty. They had been told stories about what happened to prisoners of the Americans. They had been told many things. An American corporal, no older than 23, approached carrying a wooden crate. Behind him, steam rose from metal drums where water had been heated over field stoves. The women flinched as he set the crate down before them. Inside were bars of white soap, simple, unscented, military-issue soap, and folded towels that, while coarse and olive drab, were clean. The corporal gestured toward the drums of warm water. No one moved. Then, slowly, one woman in the front of the line reached out with a shaking hand and touched the soap. She lifted it to her face, inhaling its clean, alkaline scent, and then she wept, not quietly, but with a kind of raw, uncontrolled sobbing that comes from a dam breaking inside the soul. Within moments, others joined her, tears streaming down faces that had forgotten how to produce them, their bodies shaking with sobs that sounded like both grief and relief, horror and gratitude, all at once. This was not an isolated incident. Across a collapsing geography of Nazi Germany in the spring of 1945, as American forces swept through territories where the thousand-year Reich had crumbled in just 12 years, similar scenes repeated themselves with haunting regularity. The offer of soap and warm water, such ordinary, mundane elements of daily life, became a moment of psychological fracture for thousands of German women prisoners of war. What they had been conditioned to expect from their captors bore no resemblance to what they actually received. And in that gap between expectation and reality, something profound occurred. The carefully constructed edifice of propaganda, the architecture of hatred built over more than a decade, began to crack. To understand the weight of this moment, one must first understand what these women had been told to expect. By the spring of 1945, the Nazi propaganda machine had been running at full intensity for over 12 years, but the final months of the war saw it reach a fever pitch of desperation. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, had spent the war years crafting an image of the Allied forces, particularly the Americans, as barbaric, morally degenerate, and intent on the complete annihilation of the German people. The propaganda was specific and visceral. Americans were portrayed as racially mixed mongrels, their society a chaotic stew of competing interests held together only by Jewish manipulation and capitalist greed. They were painted as incapable of discipline, their armies little more than mechanized mobs driven by base instincts. But the propaganda reserved its most terrifying predictions for what would happen to German women who fell into enemy hands. The Nazi regime, which had built its entire identity around notions of racial purity and protection of German womanhood, weaponized these anxieties in its final days. Posters appeared in the rubble-strewn streets showing caricatured American soldiers with exaggerated features, their hands reaching for cowering German women. Radio broadcasts repeated stories of systematic rape, torture, and murder. The message was clear and repeated with obsessive frequency. Capture by the Americans meant violation, degradation, and death. Women serving in auxiliary roles, the Nachrichtenhelferin of the Signals Corps, the Luftwaffenhelfer in operating anti-aircraft batteries, the Red Cross nurses, the administrative staff of military installations, absorbed these messages with particular intensity. Many had volunteered in the early years of the war, drawn by patriotic fervor or economic necessity. By 1945, most were simply trying to survive in a world that had become unrecognizable. They had watched their cities burn under waves of Allied bombers. They had seen the Wehrmacht, once invincible, dissolve into streams of defeated men trudging westward. They had heard the rumors from the Eastern Front, whispered stories of what Soviet forces did to German women in occupied territories. The propaganda told them the Americans would be no different, perhaps worse. Better to die than to be captured. This was a final message drummed into their consciousness as the rye entered its death throes. The reality they encountered was something else entirely. When American forces overran military installations, hospitals, communication centers, and defensive positions in the war's final weeks, they found themselves responsible for thousands of German women in military and quasi-military roles. The U.S. Army's policy toward these prisoners was dictated by the Geneva Conventions, military pragmatism, and an ingrained cultural ethos that viewed the mistreatment of women as fundamentally dishonorable. Orders from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force were explicit. All prisoners, regardless of sex, were to be treated in accordance with international law. They were to be provided with food, water, shelter, and medical care. No violence, no retribution, no revenge. But beyond the official policies lay something deeper and more culturally significant. The American soldiers who processed these prisoners, many of them draftees from small towns and cities across the United States, brought with them a worldview shaped by different values. They had grown up in a society where, despite its many flaws and contradictions, certain baseline assumptions about human dignity held sway. The notion of offering basic hygiene facilities to prisoners wasn't seen as mercy or generosity. It was simply what civilized people did. Soap and water were not luxuries to be rationed or symbols of power to be wielded. They were necessities, as fundamental as food or shelter. The American logistical system, that vast mechanized miracle of industrial organization, ensured that even in the chaos of rapid advance, supplies flowed with remarkable consistency. Soap was manufactured by the millions of bars, shipped across the Atlantic, distributed through supply chains that stretched from ports in France to frontline units deep in Germany. Water purification units and field heating equipment meant that even in temporary encampments, hot water could be provided. What seemed impossible to the German women, that an army in the field, thousands of miles from home, moving at breakneck speed through hostile territory, would take the time and allocate the resources to provide warm water and soap to enemy prisoners, was simply standard operating procedure for American forces. When that first bar of soap was pressed into a trembling hand, when that first bucket of warm water was offered, the psychological impact was seismic. The women who wept were not crying merely from relief, though relief was certainly part of it. They wept because they suddenly understood the magnitude of the lie they had been living inside. Everything they had been told, everything they had believed or half-believed or pretended to believe, was revealed as fiction. The Americans were not monsters. They were, in many cases, barely more than boys themselves, homesick and tired and wanting nothing more than for the war to end so they could go home. They offered soap with the same casual matter-of-factness that they might offer a cigarette to a fellow soldier. Historical record preserved in the National Archives document these interactions with bureaucratic precision. Prisoner processing forms, after-action reports, medical evaluations, and intelligence debriefings all contain references to the psychological state of female prisoners upon capture. A report from the 78th Infantry Division, dated May 2, 1945, notes, female auxiliary personnel taken into custody near Halberstadt exhibited extreme fear initially, anticipating harsh treatment. When provided standard POW rations and hygiene facilities, many displayed emotional reactions including crying and expressions of disbelief. Medical personnel report no cases of abuse or mistreatment by American forces. Similar documentation exists across multiple units and time periods. A medical officer with the 9th Armored Division wrote in his diary, later donated to the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center, "The German women we processed today were in pitiable condition, but not from anything we had done. They arrived terrified, some hysterical, clearly expecting the worst. When we set up washing facilities and distributed soap and clean clothing, several broke down completely. One kept saying, 'Wear 'em, wear 'em.' Why? Why?" As if kindness was incomprehensible. It made me angry, not at them, but at what had been done to their minds. The soap itself became a symbol that transcended its material function. For the German women prisoners, that simple bar of white soap represented a fundamental break with the reality they had known. In Germany by 1945, soap had become a luxury. The Allied bombing campaign had destroyed chemical plants and disrupted supply chains. Raw materials were diverted to military production. Civilian rations had been cut repeatedly. Many German women had not held a fresh bar of soap in months or even years. They had made do with harsh substitutes, or gone without, or bartered precious items for tiny slivers on the black market. But the soap's symbolic weight went beyond scarcity. In the architecture of Nazi ideology, the distribution of resources was always tied to racial and political hierarchies. Access to goods was a marker of status within the Volksgemeinschaft, the national community. Outsiders, Jews, Slavs, political prisoners, forced laborers, were deliberately deprived as a form of dehumanization. The withholding of basic hygiene was a tool of oppression. The German women now held in American custody had been raised in this system. They understood, on a visceral level, that deprivation was how you communicated worthlessness, how you broke people down, how you asserted dominance. That the Americans did not operate this way, that they freely distributed soap to enemy prisoners, was a revelation that struck at the ideological foundations of everything they had been taught. If the enemy treats you with basic human decency when they have every reason and opportunity to exact revenge, what does that say about who they are? And more disturbingly, what does it say about the regime that told you they were monsters? The transformation was not universal or immediate, but it was widespread enough to be noticed and documented. American interrogators, trained to assess the psychological state and potential intelligence value of prisoners, noted a pattern. German women POWs who had been processed through standard detention facilities, who had been given access to washing facilities, clean clothing, and adequate food, proved far more cooperative and willing to provide information than those who remained gripped by fear. A Counterintelligence Corps report from June 1945 observed, subject female prisoners who have experienced several days in U.S. custody typically demonstrate marked shift in attitude. Initial hostility or terror gives way to confusion, then gradual acceptance of their situation. Many volunteer information without pressure. The provision of basic necessities appears to have significant psychological impact, dismantling preconceptions about American intentions. This was not a calculated psychological operation, though its effects certainly benefited Allied intelligence efforts. It was simply the result of American forces following their own standard procedures and cultural norms. But in doing so, they inadvertently waged a form of ideological warfare far more effective than any propaganda leaflet. They demonstrated through actions, not words, that the Nazi worldview was built on lies. The sound of water being poured from buckets into washing basins became another recurring element in the testimonies of survivors and witnesses. That particular splash and trickle, the sound of cleanliness being offered, echoed through decades of memory. In oral histories collected in later years, elderly women who had been young auxiliary personnel in 1945 would speak of that sound with an almost mystical reverence. "I can still hear it," one woman told an interviewer in 1989. The sound of water being poured. We had expected to die, or worse. Instead, they gave us warm water. Clean water. I washed my hands and face, and I realized I had forgotten what it felt like to be clean. Not just my skin, but somehow deeper. Does that make sense? It made perfect sense. The act of washing, one of humanity's most basic rituals, carries profound psychological and spiritual weight. Across cultures and throughout history, washing represents renewal, purification, the removal of contamination, both physical and spiritual. For women who had spent months or years in a state of physical deprivation and moral compromise, serving a regime that demanded complicity and atrocity, the act of washing with clean water and real soap became a kind of baptism. It marked a boundary between the before and the after, between the world of Nazi Germany and whatever came next. The American soldiers who provided these facilities rarely understood the full weight of what they were doing. To them, it was simply the right thing to do, the normal thing to do. Many had sisters, mothers, girlfriends back home. The idea of treating women prisoners with anything less than basic decency was, for most, simply unthinkable. This itself was a product of American culture in the 1940s, with all its contradictions and complexities. The same society that offered soap to German POWs practiced racial segregation at home and held Japanese Americans in internment camps. American treatment of prisoners was not uniformly benevolent. There were failures, abuses, moments when exhaustion or anger or prejudice won out over policy. But the baseline expectation, the cultural norm that troops were trained to follow and largely did follow, was one that recognized common humanity even across the lines of war. This stood in stark contrast to the Nazi system, which had systematically eroded such recognition. The Third Reich's treatment of prisoners, particularly on the Eastern Front, was characterized by deliberate brutality and neglect. Soviet POWs died by the millions in German custody, worked to death, starved, shot. This was not accidental or the result of supply difficulties. It was policy, flowing from an ideology that classified entire categories of human beings as unto mention, subhumans unworthy of protections normally afforded to prisoners of war. German women serving the Reich may not have known the full extent of these crimes, but they knew enough. They knew that mercy was weakness, that the enemy was to be destroyed, that there was no middle ground between total victory and total annihilation. When American forces demonstrated that another way was possible, that even in war certain boundaries could be maintained, it called into question everything. If the enemy could show mercy when they had won, what had been the point of the Reich's cruelty when it held power? If American soldiers could treat German prisoners with basic dignity, what did that say about the constant propaganda claims that Americans were racially inferior, morally degenerate, incapable of civilization? The transformation in individual consciousness took many forms. Some women experienced it as a sudden epiphany, a moment when the scales fell from their eyes. Others underwent a slower, more painful process of reassessment that would continue for years. Still others resisted the implications, clinging to fragments of the old ideology, blaming the defeat on betrayal or bad luck rather than fundamental moral failure. But even resistance required acknowledgement of the cognitive dissonance. You cannot see kindness once it has been offered. You cannot feel the sensation of washing with soap and warm water after months of deprivation. In the displaced persons camps and POW facilities that dotted the American occupation zones in the months following VE Day, these transformations continued and deepened. German women prisoners are provided not just with hygiene facilities but with medical care, adequate nutrition, opportunities for work and education, and eventually paths toward reintegration into civilian life. The soap and warm water of those first encounters became part of a larger pattern of treatment that consistently contradicted everything they had been told to expect. Red Cross workers, both American and international, documented the physical and psychological recovery of these women. Weight was regained, diseases were treated, but more significantly, something shifted in their bearing and outlook. The hunted, terrified look in their eyes gradually faded. They began to engage with their circumstances rather than simply enduring them. They asked questions. They sought information about family members. They made plans for the future, something that had seemed impossible in the final months of the Reich, when there seemed to be no future at all, only a choice between destruction and a fate worse than death. The epilogue to these moments played out over decades. Germany underwent its own painful process of denazification and reconstruction, both physical and moral. The women who had wept upon receiving soap in the spring of 1945 became part of that larger story. Some spoke openly about their experiences, contributing to the historical record. Others kept silent, carrying their memories privately. But the lesson remained, embedded in individual and collective memory, the moment when propaganda met reality and shattered. That lesson was not just about the falsity of Nazi claims about American barbarism. It was something more fundamental about the nature of ideology itself. When a political system must rely on lies about basic human interactions to maintain control, when it must convince its people that kindness from the enemy is impossible, that system has already admitted its own moral bankruptcy. The Third Reich told its people that the world was a zero-sum struggle for racial survival, that mercy was weakness, that the strong dominated and the weak perished. When American soldiers offered soap and warm water to German women prisoners, they demonstrated that another worldview was possible, one in which victory did not require dehumanization, in which strength could be tempered with decency, in which even enemies retained their essential humanity. The soap, then, became more than a cleaning agent. It became a symbol of the industrial and moral abundance that characterized American power. The United States could afford to give soap to its enemies because it was rich enough to produce more than enough for everyone. But more than that, American culture, flawed and contradicted as it often was, still retained a basic assumption that human dignity was not a zero-sum result. Treating prisoners decently did not diminish American soldiers. It affirmed their own humanity. This stood as perhaps the most devastating ideological defeat the Nazi regime suffered. Not the military collapse, not the destruction of German cities, not even the revelation of the concentration camps, though all these mattered enormously, but the simple, repeated demonstration that the enemy German soldiers and civilians had been taught to hate and fear was capable of basic kindness, that the Americans, the British, even the French, did not need to brutalize the defeated to prove their victory, that a different way of organizing human society was possible, one not built on domination and terror. In the end, the women who wept when offered soap and warm water were mourning many things at once. They mourned the lies they had believed or failed to question. They mourned the years lost to a cause now revealed as hollow. They mourned the dead, the destroyed, the irretrievably broken. But they also wept from something like relief, or perhaps the first glimmer of hope that survival was possible, that the world after the riot might be something other than an extension of its cruelties. 70 years later, when the last of those women passed from living memory into history, they left behind a lesson that remains relevant. Ideology is powerful, but it is not invincible. Propaganda can shape perception, but it cannot completely override direct experience. When lies meet reality, reality wins, sometimes slowly, sometimes with great pain, but eventually, inevitably. A bar of soap and a bucket of warm water seem like small things, hardly worth noting in the vast machinery of war and politics. But in the right moment, offered to the right person, they can crack open a worldview and let the light in. The American soldiers who carried those wooden crates and heated those drums of water were not trying to be heroes or change anyone's mind about democracy versus fascism. They were just following orders, doing their jobs, trying to act like decent human beings in an indecent situation. But in doing so, they struck a blow for human dignity more effective than any bomb or bullet. They proved that mercy is not weakness, that kindness is not knavery, that treating even enemies with basic respect is not a betrayal of one's own side, but an affirmation of the values supposedly being fought for. And so the soap remains, in memory and in symbol. Simple, white, unscented military-issue soap. The kind of mundane object that normally passes beneath the notice of history. But in April 1945, in a rainy detention compound somewhere in defeated Germany, it became something else. A key that unlocked a prison built not of wire and canvas, but of lies and fear. The women who held it and wept understood, perhaps before they could even articulate it, that they had been given something far more valuable than cleanliness. They had been given the first evidence that the world they were entering might operate according to different rules, might make space for mercy, might recognize that even in the midst of total war, humanity need not be completely abandoned. That is a larger truth that echoes down through the decades. Freedom and abundance are not just material conditions, though they include material prosperity. They are also spiritual states, reflections of society's fundamental assumptions about human worth and the proper organization of power. A society that can afford to give soap to its enemies, that chooses to do so as a matter of course, is one that has not lost sight of essential human dignity. The women who wept in 1945 had come from society that weaponized deprivation, that used the withholding of basic necessities as a tool of control and domination. The contrast could not have been more stark or more devastating to their understanding of the world. In the sound of water poured into a washing basin, in the feeling of a clean bar of soap pressed into a trembling palm, in the simple invitation to wash away the grime of war and propaganda, something changed. Not everything, not immediately, but something. A crack in the edifice, a moment when reality broke through the lies. And from such moments, slowly and painfully, a different future became possible.